Around 720 years before the birth of Christ, an army marched north into Egypt. It didn't come to loot it, it came to save it. Egypt was fractured, weak, torn apart by rival princes squabbling over a crown that meant less every year. The temples were neglected. The old order had collapsed into competing regional rulers, none of them strong enough to reunify the country their ancestors had built. The army that marched in unified the entire Nile Valley under one crown for the first time in centuries, restored the old temples, rebuilt what had fallen into ruin, and then sat on Egypt's throne as its rightful pharaohs for the better part of 100 years. That army came from a kingdom to the south in what is now Sudan. Its kings are recorded in history as Egypt's 25th dynasty. Today, historians call them the Black Pharaohs. We built that kingdom. It was called Kush, and its story didn't end when Egypt's did. It started centuries before, and it outlasted Egypt as an independent power by hundreds of years. Almost nobody teaches this. We're going to. Kush existed long before it ever marched into Egypt. Centered along the Nile in what's now Sudan, the kingdom's roots stretch back over 4,000 years, with early capitals at Kerma and later at Napata, deep in Nubia, the region historians use to describe this stretch of the Nile south of Egypt. The earliest phase of this civilization, centered at Kerma, built massive mud brick temple structures and royal tombs on a scale that rivaled anything Egypt was building at the same period. Kerma's largest religious structure, known today as the Western Defufa, still stands partially intact after more than 3,000 years. A solid mud brick monument roughly 18 meters tall. Egyptian sources from this era describe Kerma with a mix of respect and anxiety, because for long stretches, Kerma was powerful enough to threaten Egypt's own southern border, not the other way around. They were never Egypt's shadow. They were Egypt's neighbor, its trading partner, sometimes its rival, and for long stretches, its equal in wealth. Gold moved north out of Nubian mines in such volume that the ancient Egyptian word for gold and the word for Nubia are closely linked in the historical record. Ivory, ebony, incense, and cattle moved through Kushite hands on their way to Egyptian markets, and Kushite soldiers served in Egyptian armies for centuries, sometimes as conquered subjects, sometimes as trusted allies, and the balance of power between the two civilizations shifted back and forth for 2,000 years before Kush ever sat on Egypt's throne. By the 8th century before Christ, a Kushite king named Piye watched Egypt's fractured state from the south, and he decided it was an insult to the gods both civilizations shared. Piye marched north with his army, defeated the fractured Egyptian princes one by one, and did something unusual for a conqueror. Historical inscriptions describe him requiring the defeated rulers to personally purify themselves before he would even receive their surrender, because he considered the throne of Egypt sacred and refused to let it be approached carelessly, even in defeat. This wasn't a raid, it was a campaign to restore what Piye saw as legitimate order to a civilization he respected deeply. The great, triumphal stele he had carved to record the campaign reads less like a boast and more like a religious duty fulfilled. He unified the Nile Valley from deep in Sudan all the way to the Mediterranean, becoming pharaoh of a kingdom larger than Egypt had controlled in centuries. Piye's successors ruled as Egypt's 25th dynasty for roughly 75 years. They didn't loot Egypt's temples, they restored them. They revived artistic and religious traditions that had fallen out of practice for centuries and built new pyramids at a pace Egypt itself hadn't seen in 1,000 years, smaller and steeper than the Giza pyramids, but far more numerous. Today, Sudan holds more pyramids than Egypt does. Over 200 of them, built by Kushite kings and queens, most still standing in the desert at Meroe and Nuri, visited by a fraction of the tourists who visit Giza every year. We want to be precise about who did what here, because the real story is more interesting than a simple villain. Kush's rule over Egypt ended around 656 years before Christ, when the Assyrian Empire invaded from the northeast, sacked Egyptian cities, and eventually installed a new Egyptian dynasty, the 26th, back on the throne. Kushite forces retreated south to Napata and then further to Meroe, but they were not destroyed. The kingdom continued on its own terms for another 1,000 years, which we'll get to. Here's the part that matters for why so few people know this happened at all. That 26th dynasty, ruling Egypt afterward, did engage in some deliberate erasure, chiseling Kushite names and images off certain monuments and inscriptions, a practice historians call damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, a way of trying to write a predecessor out of the historical record. That part is documented, real, and worth naming plainly. But that alone doesn't explain why the Black Pharaohs are still largely unknown outside academic circles more than 2,500 years later. The bigger reason is centuries newer, and it isn't Egyptian at all. When European Egyptology developed as a field starting in the 1800s, it treated Nubia and Kush as peripheral, minor, a footnote to the real civilization to the north. Early European excavators poured resources into Egyptian sites, while Nubian sites went comparatively unexcavated for decades. Museums built entire wings around Egyptian pharaohs, while Kushite artifacts, when they were recovered at all, often sat uncatalogued in storage for generations. Textbooks that spent chapters on Giza spent a paragraph, if that, on Meroe, and popular culture followed the textbooks. This wasn't one villain's decision on one afternoon. It was a pattern, repeated and reinforced for nearly 200 years, of an entire field deciding one African civilization was worth remembering in detail and the one to its south wasn't. That pattern is what we're pushing back against. Not by blaming Egypt, ancient or modern, a nation of people who did not make this choice, but by telling you plainly what the field left out. Kush didn't end when its rule over Egypt did. The kingdom retreated south, recentered around the city of Meroe, far enough from Egypt's new rulers, and eventually from Assyrian and Persian influence to develop entirely on its own terms, and kept going for another 1,000 years. At Meroe, we developed one of the earliest known writing systems in Africa outside Egypt, Meroitic script, still not fully deciphered by modern linguists to this day, meaning we can pronounce many of the words but don't yet fully understand the underlying language they represent. We built an ironworking industry so extensive that some historians have called ancient Meroe an early center of iron production comparable in scale to anywhere else in the ancient world at the time, its furnace mounds still visible today, centuries of slag heaps marking where Kushite smiths worked iron on an industrial scale, producing tools and weapons that supplied the kingdom and moved along its trade networks. We were ruled at multiple points by powerful queens, the Kandakes, warrior queens who led armies and ruled as sovereigns in their own name, not as regents standing in for absent kings. One of them, Amanirenas, led Kushite forces against the Roman Empire itself after Rome pushed into Kushite territory following its conquest of Egypt, fighting Roman legions to a standstill and ultimately negotiating a peace on favorable terms, an outcome very few of Rome's opponents on any continent could claim at the height of Roman military power. We opened with an army marching north to restore a throne. We're closing with a kingdom that outlasted the throne it once sat on. Kush ruled Egypt as its rightful pharaohs for 75 years. Kush built more pyramids than Egypt has today. Kush developed its own writing system, ran an ironworking industry at massive scale, and was defended by warrior queens who fought Roman legions to a standstill and negotiated peace on our own terms. And after all of that, most people have never heard the name. That's not because Egypt tried to erase us. It's because 200 years of scholarship decided our story was a footnote to someone else's, a decision made in European lecture halls and museum storage rooms centuries after Kush itself had fallen by people who never set foot in Meroe. We don't think it's a footnote. We think it's the main story. And we think the pyramids still standing in the Sudanese desert, more than twice as many as Egypt has, agree with us. Not a footnote. The main story, written in more than 200 pyramids, the sand never got to erase.